Dead people aren't resting in peace. They're working. You've been told that death is the end-of-finish line, a sleep, a grand silence where nothing moves and nothing matters. Heaven if you're good, hell if you're bad. That's the story. But what if that's not the truth? What if the souls who've left their bodies are more alive now than ever? They're not floating in some eternal nap, but evolving, learning, and even guiding the living. Edgar Cayce, a man once dismissed as just a sleeping psychic, offered something radically different. His readings spoke of an afterlife filled with motion, with choice, with purpose. A place where souls aren't punished or rewarded, but awakened. Where life doesn't stop, it shifts. And if what Cayce said is true, then everything we've believed about death has been built on a lie designed to keep us afraid, obedient, and small. But not anymore. You're here. So let's tear open the veil. Edgar Cayce didn't look like someone who would challenge the deepest spiritual assumptions of the modern world. He was a quiet, soft-spoken man from rural Kentucky. No robes, no temples. Just a man who, when he lay down and entered a trance, spoke truths that shook the foundations of everything we thought we knew about life and, more importantly, about death. They called him the sleeping prophet, but what he revealed while unconscious was anything but dreamy. He painted a picture of the afterlife that wasn't mystical fluff or religious guilt. It was structured, intelligent, and shockingly active. According to Cayce, when the physical body dies, the soul doesn't vanish into some blissful sleep or face eternal torment. It moves into what he called the astral plane, a dimension not made of clouds or fire, but of energy, reflection, and learning. Cayce described this astral world as a realm that mirrors the earth in many ways, but stripped of physical distraction. It's not a holding pen or a waiting room, it's a continuation. And what happens there isn't chaos or fantasy, it's review, recalibration, and often healing. Souls in the astral plane are not just lingering, they're engaging in something deeper. Cayce described this space as one where souls begin to digest the life they just lived. They reflect, they process, they revisit moments that shaped them, not to be punished or glorified, but to understand. He spoke of souls experiencing the ripple effects of their choices, not through judgment, but through direct insight. Imagine feeling how your actions impacted others, not because someone tells you it was right or wrong, but because you see it for yourself. That kind of learning doesn't come from guilt. It comes from the truth. Some souls, Cayce said, move quickly through this process. Others linger, not because they're forced to, but because they aren't ready to move on. They may feel attached to certain people, places, or regrets, and some don't even fully realize they've died. That's how close the astral realm is to the world we know it, brushes up against our reality, just beyond the range of ordinary perception. Which is why, according to Cayce, some souls still try to interact with the living, not to haunt them, but to guide them, to resolve something, to complete what was unfinished. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because if Cayce is right, and his thousands of trance readings suggest he might be, then we've been sold a deeply incomplete story about death, not just by religion, but by society, by education, by culture itself. Death has been framed as a full stop, so we stop thinking about what comes next. Because when you believe nothing happens after this, it's easier to manipulate your now. It's easier to keep you numb, compliant, afraid. But if the soul continues, if it evolves, then suddenly, the stakes of this life look very different. Every choice echoes, every interaction ripples. And that's where it gets even more interesting. Because some of Cayce's most controversial insights, like what happens to certain souls who resist change, or how soul groups work, were never meant to be public. In fact, some of them are too volatile to share openly. That's why we've tucked them into Insights Academy, our free newsletter where we go deeper than we ever could here. Sign up at the link in the description and you'll get instant access to the ebook, The Kibber Lion Free, for a limited time. Casey's afterlife isn't a fantasy, it's a framework, one where free will never dies and spiritual growth never stops. He described the astral world as a school of its own that reflects the lessons of Earth and offers preparation for what comes next. Because what comes next isn't decided by anyone but you. There's no cosmic court sentencing you to bliss or fire. There's just consciousness, evolution, and the constant opportunity to rise. And that simple truth might be more liberating than any afterlife fairy tale ever could be. One of the most misunderstood aspects of what happens after death is the idea of judgment. We've been told for centuries that once we die, we stand trial. A bearded figure on a throne, a flaming pit beneath us, scales weighed with sin and virtue. You're either forgiven or damned. But Edgar Cayce's readings offered something far more profound and far less theatrical. He described not a court, but a mirror. Not a judgment day, but a review. The soul isn't punished or praised, it's given the opportunity to see itself, not through the eyes of a deity, but through the lens of pure, unfiltered truth. According to Cayce, this review begins shortly after the soul enters the astral plane. It's not forced, it's not ceremonial, it's natural. The soul is drawn inward, like a river returning to its source. What it experiences isn't condemnationite's clarity. You relive key moments of your life, not in a flash or a montage, but in a way that lets you feel the full emotional and spiritual impact of your choices. And here's the twist. You feel it from both sides. You see not just what you did, but how it felt to the people you affected. Their joy, their pain, their confusion. You live it as if it were your own. This isn't cruelty, it's evolution. It's the soul understanding cause and effect at the deepest level. There's no angel wagging a finger, no voice booming from above. Just you, your experiences, and the truth you might have been too distracted or afraid to see while you were alive. Cayce emphasized that this process isn't about shame, it's about alignment. It's the soul aligning with a higher awareness of who it truly owned, what it came here to do. And that's where things get real, because if your life doesn't end in judgment, but in understanding, then death isn't about guilt, it's about growth. You're not being punished, you're being prepared. This review allows the soul to see where it veered off course, not to suffer, but to course correct. That could mean healing from old trauma. It could mean choosing to return in another life to complete unfinished lessons. It could even mean guiding others from the non-physical realm, helping them avoid the very mistakes you made. But the biggest truth Cayce revealed is this: nothing is hidden in the afterlife. Not from others, but from yourself. There are no masks in the astral world. The lies you told, the stories you believed, the excuses you leaned on, they don't hold up there, because you can't run from your own consciousness. And for some, that's the hardest part. Not being judged by an external force, but having to face the mirror and see what you've been avoiding your whole life. It's why so many people cling to simple narratives about death. Heaven and hell are easier, they're clear, they're binary. But Cayce's version, it puts responsibility back on your shoulders, not as a burden, but as a gift. Because it means your growth never stops. It means you always have the power to change, to realign, to rise. Even in death, you're still the author of your story. And if that's true, then life isn't about avoiding punishment, it's about preparing for clarity. It's about making choices now that you'll be proud to revisit later. Not because anyone's keeping score, but because the real judge has always been your higher self, the version of you that sees beyond ego, beyond fear, beyond shame. So the question becomes, are you living a life you'll be ready to see again? The dead aren't as far away as we think. According to Edgar Cayce, when we die, we don't vanish into some distant realm. Beyond reach, we slip into a reality that brushes up against this one, just beyond the limits of what most can perceive. He called it the astral plane. Not a dreamy paradise or nightmarish punishment, but a vivid, conscious space filled with movement, energy, and intention. It's the in-between. The middle ground between lives, between forms, between levels of consciousness, and it's more alive than most of the world we see around us. Casey said the astral plane is where most souls go after physical death. It's the space where you unpack your last life, meet with other souls from your group, and begin the process of reorientation. But this isn't limbo, and it's definitely not purgatory. The souls here are in motion, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in turmoil, depending on how they exited life and what they've brought with them. There are layers to this place, different levels of vibration, and your experience depends entirely on the state of your consciousness. You don't get placed in a realm, you resonate into one. Souls arrive here carrying the energetic imprint of their most recent incarnation. That includes memories, emotions, beliefs, even unresolved wounds. Those unresolved parts don't magically vanish. They're what you work through in this space. Casey said it's like entering a school of mirrors. Everywhere you turn, you see yourself, your habits, your attachments, your unfinished lessons reflected back to you. Some souls embrace the process, others resist. And the difference, Casey insisted, determines how long you remain there and what comes next. There are others there, 2 souls from your past lives, people you loved, people you wronged, and members of your soul group. Casey explained that we reincarnate in clusters groups of souls that evolve together over lifetimes. You might not recognize them by their past identities, but you'll feel them, because the bond goes beyond memory. In the astral, you reconnect. Sometimes to complete lessons, sometimes to help others rise. These aren't just reunions, they're collaborations. Spiritual progress, he said, is a group effort. And here's what challenges the way we think about death most. Some souls in the astral are still influencing the living, not as ghosts or specters, but as energetic presences. They whisper ideas, shift emotions, nudge decisions. Casey believed that the dead can act as guardians, messengers, even inspirers. Some people have ideas that come out of nowhere. According to Casey, that nowhere might be the astral plane. The boundary between the living and the dead isn't brick and mortar, it's vibration. When your state of mind elevates, sometimes you tune into them without even knowing it. But not all souls move on quickly. Some cling to what they left behind. Casey warned of what he called earthbound, souls those who remain attached to their former life due to fear, obsession, or unfinished business. These souls are often confused, lost, or in denial that they've passed. And they stay stuck, not because they're trapped by an external force, but because they haven't accepted the transition. It's not punishment, it's resistance. And even here, free will reigns. The astral plane is not a fantasy land. It's not religious mythology. It's a realm of deep reflection, energetic interaction, and continued spiritual education. And Casey emphasized that it's as real as anything we experience on Earth, just operating on a frequency we've been conditioned not to see. That conditioning keeps us disconnected from the truth. Because if you knew the dead weren't far away, if you knew they could still teach, still guide, still feel, you'd stop seeing death as the end. You'd stop fearing it. And a population that doesn't fear death? That's a population that's hard to control. So maybe the astral isn't just a mystery waiting to be solved. Maybe it's a message, a reminder that everything continues, that our lives are not one-shot accidents, but chapters in a long, purposeful journey. And if the souls you've loved are there watching, working, evolving, then you're not alone. You never were. If you think the afterlife is a place of eternal rest, you've been sold a soothing illusion. According to Edgar Casey, the dead don't lounge in bliss or drift in silence. They're active, purposeful, engaged in work that may be invisible to us but no less real. Death doesn't mark the end of effort. It marks a shift in what effort means. The soul isn't put on pause. It continues its mission. In many cases, that mission expands. Casey described a post-death state where souls aren't idle observers, they're contributors. Some return briefly to guide loved ones through dreams, gut feelings, or those strange moments where you sense someone watching, not in fear, but in calm familiarity. Others operate on subtler levels, influencing the development of ideas, inventions, or shifts in collective energy. We've been taught to dismiss these nudges, to label them as coincidence or imagination. But Casey insisted they are very real and very intentional. When you feel unexpectedly protected in a crisis, when inspiration strikes you like lightning, when a voice in your head stops you just before you make a mistake that could be someone who's no longer in this world but hasn't left your life. Some souls, Casey said, choose to continue their soul mission from the other side, especially those who are already living in service while embodied. If you spent your life lifting others, healing, guiding, or teaching, that drive doesn't vanish with your last breath. In fact, it may amplify. Without the burden of the physical body, the soul can direct its energy more freely. It can assist without limits. Souls can form networks, what Casey called councils, that work together to influence events on Earth from behind the scenes, not as puppet masters, but as stabilizers, helpers. Invisible hands gently adjusting the course when chaos threatens to overtake. This, Casey said, is especially true in times of global crisis or collective transformation. The dead aren't just watching, they're intervening when possible, not through miracles, but through energetic influence. They plant ideas in minds that are ready to receive them. They inspire courage in people on the edge of collapse. They weave support through the invisible fabric that connects us all. And they don't do it for glory or reward. They do it because the soul's true nature is growth, and growth doesn't stop at death. Some souls also use this phase to begin preparing for their return. They study, reflect, and train, yes. Train for future lives. Earth is a school, Casey said, and those who choose to return often spend time sharpening the tools they'll need for the next round. This might involve reviewing old karmic patterns, reconnecting with members of their soul group to coordinate incarnations, or working with more evolved souls to plan the circumstances of their next mission. Nothing is random. You don't just roll the dice and land in a body. There's intention behind it all, a purpose to each placement. And then there are souls who've completed much of their earthly work. Casey described these beings as operating more like teachers or guides still involved with Earth, but no longer bound by it. They move between dimensions, acting as bridges. They're often drawn to those who are awakening, those beginning to question everything they've been taught. They don't force themselves into your life. They wait until you start listening, until your frequency starts to match theirs. That's when the connection strengthens. That's when guidance becomes clear. We've been led to believe that the dead are gone, that their influence ends with the obituary. But according to Casey, the truth is far more profound and far more comforting. The dead may be out of sight, but they're not out of reach. They're still with us, still working, still guiding. And if we quiet the noise and pay attention, we might just realize we've never been alone in our growth. Not in life, not in death, not ever. The word reincarnation still makes some people uncomfortable. For others, it sounds like a punishment, an endless loop of lives, deaths, and rebirths with no escape in sight. But Edgar Casey's readings flipped that narrative on its head. Reincarnation, according to him, isn't a curse. It's a choice. The soul isn't being forced back into Earth like a convict doing time. It's returning because it wants to learn, to grow, to evolve. Casey didn't describe Earth as a prison, it's a classroom. A complex, sometimes painful, often beautiful classroom where the soul comes to remember who it truly is. This idea disrupts almost everything we've been taught. It means you didn't just appear here out of nowhere. You're not a one-time accident or a lucky biological lottery ticket. You're here for a reason, chosen by you, shaped by you, and tailored to what your soul needed next. And when this life ends, you'll choose again. If there's more to learn, more to resolve, more to experience, you return. Not because someone sends you back, but because your soul sees the value in continuing the curriculum. Casey explained that each life is an opportunity, a new environment, a different body, a chance to experience the other side of the coin. Maybe you were wealthy last time and needed to understand humility. Maybe you were cold and logical and now need to learn compassion. Maybe you abandoned your potential and now you're back to claim it. The experiences you attract aren't punishments, they're invitations. The more you resist them, the more they repeat. But once you see them for what they are, lessons disguised as challenges, they start to shift. And so do you. And karma? It's not what people think. It's not some mystical revenge machine or divine scorekeeper. In Casey's view, karma is simply cause and effect consciousness balancing itself. It's the energetic residue of past choices, both good and bad, seeking resolution. You don't pay for your sins, you experience the consequences of your actions so you can grow. That's it. And if you've hurt others, you may come back in a situation where you get to feel the same pain, not out of punishment, but out of understanding. It's about empathy, not vengeance. But the most radical part? You don't have to come back. Casey made that clear. Reincarnation is optional. You have free will even after death. If you've evolved beyond what Earth can offer, you can move on. There are other realms, other dimensions, other classrooms. But if you still feel there's something here for you, unfinished work, a soul contract, or simply the pull of returning to help others, you choose Earth again. And each return carries more awareness, more clarity, more responsibility. It's not about suffering, it's about soul-level mastery. Casey also noted that some souls reincarnate not for themselves, but for others, to help awaken those still lost in the fog, to serve, to guide. These souls often live hard lives, not because they're clearing karma, but because they're holding space, acting as anchors of light in a world that often forgets why it's here. And many of these souls forget too until something wakes them up. A moment of loss, a deep dream, a conversation that hits too hard. Something whispers, "You've done this before. You chose this, and you'll choose again." So if reincarnation isn't a curse, what is it really? It's a reflection of how committed your soul is to growth. It's a sign that you're not afraid to face yourself again and again, until you've outgrown the need to return. And once you do, you move on, not to rest, but to serve in higher ways. But while you're here, this life, this breath, this moment, it's sacred. It's chosen. And maybe the most empowering thing Casey ever said is this: you were never forced to be here. You asked for it because you knew you could handle it. Not every soul returns to Earth. Some graduate. According to Edgar Casey, the journey of the soul doesn't stop at death, even after a few rounds of reincarnation. There are higher realms beyond this plane, vast and complex dimensions of consciousness where the focus shifts from personal growth to collective evolution. These aren't mythological heavens full of harps and halos. They are living, breathing states of awareness where souls operate with clarity, compassion, and cosmic responsibility. In these realms, the question is no longer, what can I gain? But how can I serve? Casey described these higher planes as stages of spiritual maturity. Just as a child eventually outgrows primary school, the soul eventually moves beyond Earth when it has learned what it came to learn. And once it has, it's drawn to serve something larger than itself. That service can take many forms, helping guide those still on Earth, assisting in the evolution of planetary consciousness, or contributing to the balance and expansion of energy throughout the cosmos. It sounds lofty, but Casey didn't frame this as fantasy. To him, this was simply the natural next step of the soul's progression. It's what happens when you're no longer chasing lessons, you're embodying wisdom. In these higher states, souls no longer carry the emotional baggage or egoic confusion that burden many incarnated lives. There's no fear, no scarcity, no competition. These souls understand on a cellular level that everything is connected, that your healing is mine and mine is yours. Casey suggested that in these realms, communication is telepathic, time is non-linear, and intention creates reality. There's no need for deception or manipulation. Truth is the language. Souls work in harmony, moving with a shared purpose that transcends individuality. And here's the part that reframes everything we think about spiritual growth. Evolution doesn't stop. Even in the highest realms, souls continue to expand, but the focus shifts. Instead of healing old wounds or learning through contrast, they participate in what Casey called cosmic service. That might mean helping younger souls navigate difficult transitions, guiding planetary shifts from behind the veil, or participating in the creation of new dimensions entirely. These souls aren't floating in eternal peace, they are peace, and they move through it with clarity and intent. What makes this idea so powerful is that it changes how we think about the purpose of our own lives. If these higher beings were once like us, confused, hurt, seeking, then it means we're on the same path. It means enlightenment isn't reserved for a chosen few. It's built choice by choice, lifetime by lifetime. And those who now operate in the higher planes may have once stood where you're standing now, wondering if any of this has meaning. And Casey believed they're still with us, not as masters to be worshipped, but as equal souls who simply remember more. They respond to frequency, not to begging. They don't interfere with force, but with invitation. When you elevate your consciousness through compassion, truth, and alignment, you meet them halfway, and when you do, they respond. Not with fireworks, but with the quiet unfolding of guidance that feels like it's coming from inside you, because in many ways, it is. This is why Casey warned against idolizing spiritual figures, both physical and non-physical. True spiritual evolution isn't about hierarchy, it's about expansion. If someone has reached a higher level of awareness, it doesn't mean they are above you. It means they've walked the path longer, remembered faster, and now they serve. And you will too, not out of obligation, but out of love. Because once you remember who you really are, service isn't a burden. It's the most natural thing in the world. We're not climbing some cosmic ladder to escape Earth. We're learning, remembering, and returning not to the same life, but to the same truth, expressed at a higher level. Earth is one classroom. There are many others, but the lesson is always the same. Know yourself, love others, and serve something bigger than both. And when that becomes your way of being, you won't need to seek the higher realms. They'll already be seeking you. If everything Edgar Casey described about life after death is true, if souls continue to grow, guide, reincarnate, and serve from higher realms, then why is this knowledge not everywhere? Why isn't it in textbooks? Why don't churches talk about it? Why does it feel like you have to stumble into this truth by accident, like finding a hidden message scribbled behind a painting that was hanging in your living room all along? Because you were never meant to know, at least not in the world as it's been built. Casey's insights dismantle some of the most powerful institutions that exist. Religious doctrine, political control, educational systems, consumer culture, they all rely on one core belief: that death is the end, and fear is necessary to keep you in line. If death is final, then everything you do in this life becomes loaded with pressure. You've only got one shot. You must obey to earn a reward. You must follow the rules. You must be afraid, because fear makes you predictable, and predictability is the lifeblood of control. But if you realize death is not the end, if you truly internalize that the soul is immortal, active, and evolving, it changes everything. Suddenly, fear loses its grip. You stop making choices from survival mode, you stop chasing external validation, you stop bowing to systems that benefit from your silence, you start thinking for yourself, and people who think for themselves, they're hard to program, hard to sell to, hard to control. which is why Casey's work remains largely ignored, ridiculed, or buried. He wasn't preaching a religion. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was simply sharing what he saw, over and over again. In thousands of trance readings, people would ask about health, relationships, spiritual purpose, or lost loved ones, and time after time, the answers pointed to the same truths. The soul is eternal. Your actions matter, and there's far more to reality than what we've been shown. But this kind of truth doesn't sell well. It doesn't fit in a tweet. It doesn't keep people desperate, so instead of teaching it, the world distracts you with noise. Think about it. From the moment you're born, you're flooded with messaging about what matters: money, fame, power, beauty. You're told to succeed, to win, to rise in a game you never agreed to play. You're told what to fear and what to desire. And beneath it all, there's the quiet drumbeat. This is all you've got. One life, one chance. Don't mess it up. And what does that do? It keeps you anxious. It keeps you small. It keeps you chasing illusions. But what happens when that illusion breaks? When you find out that you've lived before, that you'll live again, and that there are beings, some you've known, some you've yet to meet, who are walking with you even now, just beyond the veil, you stop playing the game. You start asking better questions. You start remembering what you actually came here to do. This knowledge is a threat, not because it's dangerous, but because it's liberating. It threatens the story that obedience equals virtue, that authority knows best, and that spirituality has to be filtered through institutions. Casey's readings say otherwise. They say that you have direct access to higher knowledge, to inner truth, to the very forces that shape this reality. And once you realize that, you become something powerful, ungovernable by fear. That's why this information has been pushed to the fringe. It's not fringe because it's false. It's fringe because it's disruptive. It upsets the machinery. It empowers the individual. It reminds you that you were never just flesh and bone, never just a name or a job or a belief system handed down to you. You are consciousness, you are memory, you are intention wrapped in skin for a moment. Here to remember something you've always known but forgotten on purpose. And once you remember, you won't be able to forget again. Because the truth has a frequency, and once it resonates, it can't be unheard. That's why it's hidden, not because it's weak, but because it's potent. And those who benefit from your confusion would rather you never find it. But you did. You're here. You're listening. You're remembering. Once you understand that death is not an end but a continuation, a shift, a return to a deeper layer of truth, you can't live the same way. You won't want to. Because suddenly, the things you thought were urgent, the job title, the perfect body, the social approval they shrink in importance. And what starts to grow is something else. Clarity, purpose, an unshakable sense that this life is not random, not meaningless, and definitely not small. Edgar Cayce didn't just describe what happens after you die, handed us the key to living differently while we're still here. Because if the soul evolves after death, it means the work you're doing now doesn't stop when your heart does. It carries forward. The conversations you're having, the fears you're facing, the healing you're doing, the love you're learning to give and receive it, all echoes beyond this life. Every choice becomes part of the curriculum, a piece of a bigger arc that stretches across lifetimes. You're not just reacting to a chaotic world, you're participating in a conscious journey, and that realization doesn't make life heavier, it makes it sacred. Casey's view of the soul as a continuous, conscious presence changes how we relate to everything. Our grief, our goals, our relationships. Losing someone doesn't mean they're gone, it means they've shifted states. They're continuing, just on a different wavelength. And knowing that shifts the way we mourn. It opens a space for connection rather than closure. It allows us to speak to them not with desperation, but with respect. Because they're not just watching from afar. In many cases, they're walking right beside you, just out of view. It also changes how you see your own pain, the traumas, The heartbreaks, the breakdowns, they stop being punishments and start being opportunities. Not in a fluffy, everything happens for a reason kind of way, but in a grounded, soul-level way that acknowledges your power to grow through what you experience. Life stops being something you survive and starts becoming something you sculpt. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I being shown here?" That shift, subtle as it may seem, is the beginning of mastery. You also start to realize you're not here by accident. You didn't just fall into this body, this family, this time period. You chose this. Or at the very least, your soul did. Maybe not for comfort, but for expansion. You came here to remember something, to break a pattern, to teach, to serve, to love deeper than you've ever loved before. And if you felt out of place most of your life, like you've been homesick for a place you can't quite name, it's probably because some part of you remembers that this isn't your first time around. And that remembering is everything. Because the moment you recall the truth of your nature, the system starts to lose its grip. You stop living in fear. You stop living on autopilot. You stop chasing the goals that were never yours to begin with. You start asking, what is real for me? What feels true in my bones? What would I do if I wasn't afraid? Casey's teachings aren't just about what happens when you die. They're about how to live while you're here, with integrity, with awareness, with the understanding that every action carries energy, and that energy follows you beyond this life. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being awake, being present, being intentional. And if you've made it this far, that probably means you've already started. You've already begun to question, to remember, to peel back the veil. But this is only the surface. Once you've glimpsed the truth, there's no going back. And honestly, why would you want to? You didn't come here to fit in, you came here to wake up. So here we are, standing on the edge of something most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. The truth about death, and not the dramatized version spoon-fed through religion, nor the clinical nothingness sold by materialist science, but something more profound, more alive. Edgar Cayce didn't say the soul ends. He said it expands. He didn't speak of final destinations. He spoke of stages, of realms, of evolution. And if that's true, if the journey continues long after this body is done, then we've been asking the wrong question all along. It's not, what happens when I die? It's, what am I doing with my life that echoes into what comes next? The idea that death is a transition and not a conclusion rewires your understanding of what matters. Suddenly, it's not about squeezing the most out of this life in a desperate attempt to leave a legacy or dodge damnation. It's about showing up with intention. It's about preparing not out of fear, but with the same reverence you'd bring to packing your bags before entering a sacred temple. Because you will leave here. That's not a threat, it's a guarantee. But how you leave what you carry with you, what you've transformed, while here, that's entirely up to you. Cayce showed us that our time on Earth is not an accident. It's not random, it's not meaningless. Came into this life with lessons to learn, people to find, and shadows to confront. And every step you take toward awareness, toward healing, toward truth, it changes not only your path, but the energy you leave behind. You're not just living for yourself. You're living in a way that impacts your soul group, your lineage, the people you'll never meet in this life, but have already crossed paths with in another. And that's what the dead are doing right now. They're still learning, still loving, still moving closer to the center of who they really are. They're not finished, and neither are you. What we call the end is just a point of transition in a much bigger story. So maybe it's time to stop treating death like the enemy and start treating it like a mirror. Because the more you understand what comes after, the more power you have to shape what comes next. Not just after you die, but tomorrow, and the next day, and every moment you're still breathing. There are things you know now that you didn't before. Things that can't be unseen. And that knowing comes with responsibility, not the kind that weighs you down, but the kind that lifts you. Live like it matters, because it does. Heal what you've been avoiding because it follows you. And love like it's the only thing you get to keep, because in many ways it is. And if you want to go even deeper, don't forget to join Insights Academy, our free newsletter. You'll get access to powerful teachings we can't share here, and, for a limited time, you'll receive a free digital copy of the Kybalion. It's more than an email list, it's a map, but all of this means nothing if you don't understand where the soul goes next and why. Click on the video you see right here. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."